I'm a big fan of the television series The West Wing. And in particular, there's a scene in The West Wing, for those who are fans, where the Chief of Staff, Leo McGarry, is having a conversation with his deputy, Josh Lyman. Josh has been going through trauma and is worried that this trauma needs to be hidden away lest he lose his job and everyone think he's crazy. In this very poignant scene, Leo speaks to Josh and tells him a story about a man who falls down a hole and gets stuck. Then a doctor comes along. The man calls out to the doctor, Doctor, I'm stuck in this hole. Can you help me? So the doctor writes a prescription, throws it down the hole, and continues on his way. Next, a priest comes along and the man yells out, Father, can you help me? I'm stuck in this hole. So the priest looks down the hole, writes a prayer on a piece of paper, throws it down the hole, and continues on his way. Then finally, a friend comes along. The man in the hole yells out, Jack, I'm stuck down this hole. Can you help me? And so Jack jumps in the hole as well. Our man in the hole says to him, You idiot. Now we're both stuck down here. What did you do that for? And his friend says, Yes, but I've been down this hole before, and I know the way out. It's striking to me that as we pick up from our Easter story last week, we pick up in another evening, another night scene. As we mentioned last week, that Jesus appeared to Mary while it was still dark. Now a whole day of sunlight has passed before the risen Christ appears again. Now in the evening. Now to his disciples, probably the men, given that Mary had come to the tomb, locked away in an upstairs room. It's a well-known story. It's a well-loved story. And in one sense, it's an easy story to preach this Sunday morning. After all, Jesus appears in the midst of a lockdown. Jesus comes to those who have barred the outside world with locked doors to protect themselves and those they love. And Jesus appears in their midst, speaking peace. Peace be with you. And that could be the end of my reflection for today. Peace be with you, the risen Lord says to you in the midst of your lockdown. Amen. Job done. Let's go home. But I suspect there's something more powerful going on here. This is a reading, as I said, that has often been interpreted and misinterpreted and used and reused, with the focus predominantly being on the second half of the reading, about Thomas and his supposed doubt, though in Greek the word doesn't really appear. But I find something else interesting in this reading. I find intriguing in this reading, both for the disciples and for Thomas, that the moments they recognize resurrection in their midst, the moments they recognize the risen Christ in their midst, are moments where Jesus shows them his wounds. It is through the experience of Jesus's woundedness that they come to experience resurrection. It is through the sharing of vulnerability that they come to experience resurrection. I suspect this is significant. So often when we speak about resurrection, the conversation comes about proof, physical proofs, demanding proofs, believe or else. Here is the evidence, the hard facts. Let me demonstrate how strong this faith is now that it has been resurrected. that I, for one, have never found such accounts of resurrection particularly compelling. My faith has rarely grown from the certainty of those who are perhaps more interested in in life without death than in resurrected life that has had to come through woundedness and vulnerability. Those figures of faith I have always found most compelling are those who have been willing to share their brokenness and woundedness with the world. I have always been attracted to biblical figures like Jacob, a character with many fatal flaws who, at the height of his brokenness or at the lowest point of his life, sits by the river Jabbok and there wrestles with God until morning, refusing to let go of God until God blesses him with a new name, a new life, a resurrected life. But as a consequence of that wrestling, Jacob would walk with a limp for the rest of his life. And many of you who have ever seen me doing pastoral care would know that I'm fond of this story, because I'm fond of the image that resurrected life is not about overcoming the imperfections of before, but about learning to walk with the limp. I am overpowered by the image that Jesus in his resurrection continues to bear the wounds of the past. And it is through showing our vulnerability, showing our brokenness, showing our woundedness that the encounter of resurrection comes. During our Lenten Bible studies recently, in fact, in the last week of our Lenten Bible study that we could gather before this lockdown began, I was deeply moved and grew deeply in my faith by members of the group willing to share their own moments of brokenness and how it was there that they had experienced the God who arrives, as we have said in previous weeks, to valleys of dry bones and to tombs, to woundedness and brokenness and scars and emptiness, and there brings life. And I was moved in my faith by those who are willing to share their stories of brokenness. Jesus comes to the midst of a locked room, to a group of people who are psychologically scarred, perhaps physically scarred, who have lost hope, who have lost their friend, who are afraid now for their own lives, and there Jesus comes sharing woundedness and thus giving the gifts of peace and the Spirit. I wonder whether they would have recognized resurrection in their midst if Jesus had come fully restored, or whether that would have allowed them to simply deny that death and pain had ever happened and pretend there was a different future for them. But the good news of this passage is not that. The good news of this passage is Jesus comes vulnerable and broken and wounded and healed. Jesus comes as evidence of the suffering God, the dead God, the crucified God, who has experienced death, who has dived into the hole of despair with us and comes to show the way out. The Christ who comes and then breathes the Spirit upon the disciples. Not upon them, but into them. The God who is intimate as each breath and comes and breathes also into us, that we too might share our vulnerabilities with others and thus reveal the truth of resurrection. My prayer for you as we continue in these times is that you do not feel like you have to have it all together. My prayer for you is not that you feel like you have to put on a show for neighbors and friends and families about how easy this is and how perfect it is and what a great opportunity for catching up on reading it is. But instead that you be willing too to share your struggles, your woundedness, and your vulnerability, so that through your life, the Spirit might reveal resurrection to others.